God, we give you thanks today for the opportunity as you continue to take the pain of my segregated childhood and give it purpose. In your name we pray. Amen. You may be seated. Well, I am the fourth of 5 children born to Oscar and Dorothy White. My parents were precious people, and I thank God I realized that while they were still living. I told them that frequently, that the people I actually thought were sent to torture me were the best folks on the planet. One of the things that you could hear either my mom or my dad say at any time about this fourth of 5 children, they would simply look at each other and say, "Lord, have mercy." So I give you permission as I share today for you to feel free to say, "Lord, have mercy." One of the things that I find about this time that I've been blessed to live in has been pain in the past actually has been given purpose, and it continues to be. One of the most life-changing conversations I have ever had occurred in September of 2018 when I, with 2 dear friends, sat in the office of Congressman John Lewis and talked with him. We were transfixed, transformed. It was amazing. And I continue to carry the energy because, you see, he was my parents' generation. There was an awareness about grace, just how amazing grace is. I've gotten to the point now, sometimes I just stop and say, "God, you outdo yourself, you know? I'm on board, I'm committed, I'm on board to the grave. You don't have to do all of this." But that's how amazing grace is. So let me lift up to you what came to me to share today. The feast day of Absalom Jones. How do you emerge from a system designed for your destruction with the unshakable notion that you are made in the image and likeness of God? How do you hold on to the reality that your freedom is an inalienable right? In other words, nobody gave it to you, and nobody can take it away. How do you find value in the midst of everyday reminders that your life is not your own? How do you love a God depicted as though he delights in your demise? The life of Absalom Jones is a great place to begin to respond to such questions. Can we learn from this man who emerged from the pit of slavery and brought others along as well? As it is stated in the brief biography in your worship bulletin, Jones was an example of persistent faith in God and in the church as God's instrument. We see in our worship bulletin a reminder that Galatians 5:1 was one of his favorite verses. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. And then the gospel lesson that you heard so preciously read. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Well, while pursuing my doctorate, I was assigned a thought-provoking book that touched upon the realities of what happened in the slave quarters of many plantations in this country. The book, entitled Down, Up, and Over: Slave Religion and Black Theology by Dwight Hopkins, who is at University of Chicago Divinity School. Hopkins shares in this book about this routine. Daily, the slave was deconstructed in the fields and in the house. But at night, the slave was reconstructed, recognizing your value is greater than it may seem. It's interesting that uneducated slaves had sense enough to know that this God is for slavery scenario, and I'm gonna remember where I am, so I'm gonna watch my words, is not so. They knew their value. A God of divinity who so loved the world, and that included them. Hopkins writes this book in a way that brings you visual reminders of what it must have been like to be deconstructed all day. You see, some children on the streets of cities around the world are deconstructed all day, even now. And the pain comes in that no one is there to reconstruct their world. Some are even profiting from their victimization financially and sleeping at night. How dare we as the church be silent? On July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass delivered a speech. He entitled it, "What Does July 4th Mean to the Slave?" Fellow citizens, Douglass wrote, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains and heavy grievous yesterdays are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. There was a contradiction in reality, celebrating freedom in America when so many were victimized by America. Hopkins' book reminds me of The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. You see, not too many years ago, I was standing outside the bus transfer station in downtown Richmond, Virginia, registering people to vote. Every single black young man that I stopped to ask were they registered said this or something close to it. No, ma'am, I'm not registered, but I cannot. I have a felony. Some of them looked younger than 12. My new friend who was helping me register people that day, we got in the car and we talked, and she said, you know, the same thing happened to you. How does this happen? It's almost like it's planned. Hear that? It's almost like it's planned. You see, as I grew older, I began to realize things were going on that I didn't always know. I didn't know you could have your record expunged. I didn't know there were non-disclosure agreements that could keep you out of jail. Now, I don't think they'll keep you out of, well, never mind. You see, when you're in control of the narrative, When you're in control of perceptions, when you have the power to determine what news, local, national, international, is repeated over and over again, what faces are on the front page, what faces greet you every morning, what discombobulated families are flashed before you as though they are the only example. When you have that power, if you're not careful, even those who look like the ones being depicted inaccurately will begin to believe it themselves. But this crazy preacher still has hope. William Cullen Bryant wrote in his poem entitled Battlefield, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again. The eternal years of God are hers." You see, you may expunge your record and yet still deal with the consequences. You may capitalize from the silence of your victims, but the road to forgiveness is paved with grace, not NDAs. Cover up the history of the continent of Africa, and you will still see the global impact of her rape. Write history to honor those who fought for the enslavement of others, and there will still be those who will emerge with a truer narrative. But how do we, the church, the called out ones, the body of a holy, living, loving, and eternal God, how do we live into our purpose? As I read our gospel lesson for today, I see the word commandment. I see the words of a Nazarene preacher giving us not a suggestion, not an option, but a commandment. Love one another. How in the world is such a thing even possible? Did Jesus really mean this? Or was Jesus just having a have mercy moment? After all, walking on water and raising the dead can kind of blow your mind a little bit. So I'm going, okay, Lord, what did you mean? Well, it was through the writings of a Catholic priest that I have an enormous amount of respect for, named Greg Boyle, Father Greg. Father Greg wrote in his writings, Tattoos on the Heart, this prayer. And I had heard the prayer before, but the way he puts it in context of pouring out his life for people is appropriate. This is his prayer, and I've prayed it for years. It's a challenge to me. That's why I keep praying it. Oh, that my heart would break with the things that break the heart of God. Wow. That takes away my right to have an opinion. Wow, that takes away my right to be offended. Wow, that means when Ku Klux and Klan come in the door, I gotta love them anyhow. That rubs me. And that's why I need it, because loving is not an option. It is not something to do when it's convenient. It is not a feel-good moment. It is knowing the love of Jesus Christ yourself, received and embraced just as you are, and then being enabled to give it in return. So how can we wounded, hurting, angry people learn to come together as one body? How can we love when some of us even lack love in our own homes? How do we love when power and prestige and fame are Lord? Can I learn to love the children of former slave owners? Can I actually love those who assume the worst of me before we even have an encounter? I still can walk into Walmart and clear out the security following me, even when I've got on a collar. Well, I see one thing today in this amazing man named Absalom Jones. He had an unshakable faith in God, and an awareness that the church is God's tool for this madness. Will you pick up your part? You would be correct to ask, how can answers come from a church, a body of believers suffering from anemia? Well, I'm glad you asked me that question. I will proceed to answer it. Have you ever knocked on a door and suddenly realized you were, in fact, already in the room? You see, beloved, we're already in the room. The answer is before us. The invitation has been issued. That's where it has to be. That's the only place where the ground is level. There are no big eyes, no little you, no country club folks. They don't get up there before my grandmother. There's the answer. And we fuddle around and we go berserk trying to figure it out. It's there. It's there. The invitation is there. You can't love your neighbor? Come. You can't love yourself? Come. You're not sure? Come. Trust and go. There's the answer. What are we looking for? You see, one of the things that I realize is my Christianity is not a license to judge people. Love who you want to love. Be who you feel you are. Trust in God. You want to be pro-life? Be pro all of life. Be pro-life for the victims of rape and incest. Be pro-life for those who need to be with their doctors to make decisions that are difficult and life-changing. Not dictated, difficult and life-changing. Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. Look at the Testament. He hung out with the prostitutes. Look at it. He hung out with people who would walk up to me and go, word. He hung out with them. Look at the Testament. So why is it that we aren't out there too? Do you have anything to offer? God has not called you to fix anything, beloved. We are called to love. God does the fixing. We are called to care. God molds the heart. And oh, if the church can move all of this stuff we got between the door and that table, life would be so much better. So here I am, as my children at Breck point out, old lady. Here I am, 6 decades and 8 years old, and still ticking. And I want to end by telling you a story. I used to serve at St. John's Church, Church Hill in Richmond. It's the historic St. John's where Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death, they do reenactments and so forth. And I served there. Whenever I would serve communion, there are these 2 precious kids, Evie and Sawyer. And they were little, and their grandmother would bring them up to the altar for communion. Inevitably, they'd get away from her. And it was so funny. Bishop, they would run to the altar. And by the time I got over there, their little hands were like this. Now, this is what really got the grandmother. Before she could get up from receiving, they skipped back to the pew. And God said to me, if more of my children realize how welcome they were, they do the same. They run to this altar and skip back to the pew because the host has invited them and wants them to come. That's what Absalom Jones got. These chains aren't Jesus. This bondage is not God. God delights in my presence. Evie and Sawyer, they got it. God delights in presence. And beloved, in my heart, when I come for communion, I run. And when I go back, I'm skipping. Because I finally got, I am loved. Cannot love me more. Will not love me less. Absalom Jones got it too.